Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome back. So what string gauge is right for you? Well, of course that depends on acoustic or electric, but I'm also going to tell you what you're not being told by a lot of these videos, because I've watched a number of them this morning and they all seem to have some things in common, right? But before we get into that, let's talk about the right strings. I'm kind of one of these guys that tends to stick with the gauge of strings that come with the guitar. Well, the factory cut the nut for that gauge. They seem to work best with the guitar. Okay, the only exception to this was my Gibson Les Paul. All of a sudden in 2018, Gibson decided to get it in their brain for some reason, let's pack this thing with 946s. What? No Les Paul in history ever came with 9s. I don't even know of any Gibson guitar that ever came with 9s. But my Les Paul came with 946s, and there was I needed to do some setups, and I could not adjust my neck. It was already backed off. And if you know anything about Gibson guitars, they use just a little nut that just kind of turns and sucks the truss rod to, tighten or loosen, right? Well, the problem is once it's loose, that's supposed to create relief. Well, it was already really loose already from the factory, so it already had as much of relief as it was going to get. And there's not enough tension on the 946s to pull the frickin' neck up enough, right? So I'm thinking, neck's got to come higher, and it can't, right? There's just no way. Defective guitar? Absolutely not. Defective people at Gibson who put on 9s. 9s are way too light for the Les Paul. So I swapped them over to 1046s, and voila! All of a sudden I had to tighten that nut up because now my neck's being sucked way up. So now at least I have adjustability in my neck, right? Which also required a little bit of adjustment in the bridge as well to raise it up too. Because raising up just the bridge before changing the strings wasn't going to work. We needed neck relief. Okay? So you always have to have a little bit, at least between 8 to 10 thousandths is about where I set my necks at, which is actually pretty much standard protocol for just about every guitar out there as far as electrics go. It's usually around 10 actually, but I like between 8 and 10 depending on the guitar. However, guitars are going to be a little different beasts. You can go to heavier gauges if you want, but what you're not being told is simply this. You're not being told that when you go to a heavier gauge, okay, for example, you're going from 9s to 10s, well, if you're at a 946, you're fine, okay? And if you're going 1046, you're generally going to be fine. The nuts have that little bit of fudge room generally in the slots. But if you start going any higher than that, you're going to have to re-slice the nut slots to accommodate the new diameter, because otherwise your strings are going to sit up too high into the slots, and yeah, they're not even going to bottom out, which means, string binding, tuning issues, right? Now here's the drawback. What you're not being told. Now you're also going to have to do a complete new setup on your guitar too, going to much thicker strings, because you're putting a lot more tension on the neck. So this means you're going to have to retighten the neck to get your relief back. And of course you're going to have to re-intonate the guitar obviously too, because of the different gauge now being much thicker. What you're not being told is if you ever want to go back to the thinner gauge, once you've sliced your nut and you've widened and deepened those slots properly, you're going to have to replace the nut. Not just a whole new setup, but a new nut. So if it turns out you don't end up liking the thicker gauge, you just destroyed your nut for nothing. So you got to kind of be ready for, having to replace that nut with a new nut again. Now, you can get a lot of choices out there for nuts. You can actually, email the manufacturer and say, hey, can you send me a replacement nut for this guitar? Blah, blah, blah. Okay, and they'll be happy to send you a replacement factory nut. And going to cost you a couple bucks probably, depending. But either way, you will have to replace that nut once you've cut it for the thicker gauge, right? Now with 946 to 1046, I've never had an issue as of yet. Even going, and now you can also drop lighter. Now here's the other thing too. You can drop lighter in gauge than what your guitar came with and not need to modify the nut at all. In fact, it'll probably work out just peachy cream, depending on your guitar. And you won't have to do anything more than maybe re-intonate the guitar. And of course you will have to reset your neck for its relief, because now you've gone with a lighter gauge, your neck's going to run even straighter, or maybe it's going to back bow on you. So you're going to have to, re-add the relief with a lighter set of strings. Again, something you are not being told by these other videos, okay? Now, as far as, and that's electrics or acoustics. Now, what you're not being told on the acoustic side of the fence, on some videos, but some did actually point this out. When you are messing with an acoustic guitar, of course, intonation has enough fudge room that even changing gauges, you really don't disturb the intonation much on an acoustic. So there's really not too much to worry about in that sense. Recutting the nut, on the other hand, is something you will still have to worry about when going to a thicker gauge. But you have to be very, very cautious on acoustic guitars, because even though they make stuff like, 13s and 15s and 16s and all that jazz, which they make for all guitars, on the acoustic guitars, they're not generally made to handle too thick of a gauge of a string. Okay, not many guitars out there are. So before you think about going from, say, 1253 or 1254s, okay, and getting up higher, you might want to really consider getting hold of the manufacturer specifically to your guitar model to make sure that that guitar can handle going to something like 13s or 15s or whatever, right? Because otherwise what's going to happen is you're going to destroy your guitar, literally. You could rip the bridge right off the body. Any number of things can happen. It can just destroy your guitar. Martin had an issue with this years and years ago. They always shipped with like a 1254. Generally everybody's doing 1253s nowadays for acoustics, because they seem to be a little bit better that way. But 1254 is usually about where Martin's max was for many years on every single model. Well, there are a lot of people that started to try and use things like 13s and so on, right? And this became dangerous to the guitars, and bridges were flying off, among other destruction. And Martin did have to come good for a lot of warranty work at the time, until they figured out what was really going on. And of course now they'll no longer cover that kind of stupidity of the owners, but they have built the guitars more stronger nowadays to handle at least a 13 gauge kind of string without having any issues. But if you do go too much higher, of course, yeah, it's your problem, and you can suck it up. And Martin guitars, as we know, are not very cheap guitars. Even their cheapest guitar that I've come across, at least in Canada, is almost $700 for basically like a 3/4 size, guitar. And left or right-handed, Martin charges no difference in price. Neither does Taylor, neither does Gibson. Okay? So you're not worried about price here, but they're not cheap guitars from Martin. So keep that in mind as well before you start screwing with stuff you really probably shouldn't be. Okay, always get a hold of the manufacturer first to find out if that model of acoustic can handle it. Now, electrics are never too much of a big deal. When you do go to a much thicker string, you may actually have to cut some slots into your saddles on your main saddle as well, right? Since you've got individual saddles on your electrics, for the majority of electrics, unless it's a fixed saddle, where you've got like a lightning bolt pattern of prefixed intonation. Those, I mean, you're not going to probably have to mess with, but it's kind of a hard to say kind of thing, right? But you may have to recut or cut some slots. I remember when I got my Gibson, Gibson had already cut slots into the saddles themselves, which was great. So when I put the new bridge on, because I went to Gold Hardware, I actually had to put my own indentation slots in. And there's a method of doing that, which StewMac shows with a little chirk with a string, and a hammer, and kapang, and that's how you get it in really easy. Just make sure it's dead center before you smack down with the hammer, because there's nothing worse than an offset saddle, and then you're like, oh man, screwed that up, and you only get one shot at it. So anyways, but with the nut area too, acoustics are the same way. When you go to a thicker gauge, you have to recut the slots in the nut, you're going to have to reset up the relief, etc. Then when you go back to the stock gauge, now they're going to be sitting down way too low, now you're going to have to replace the nut. Now, on acoustics or electrics, going from a stock gauge to the lighter gauges, you don't have to worry about the nut so much, right? Because you're not going to go light enough to even have to worry about recutting slots, okay? But if you wanted to, I suppose you could make your own custom nut for, say, 7s. If you wanted 7 gauge, right? And then you could just cut the depth exactly as you need it. Because the strings need to sit generally flush with the top of the nut, okay? So when you run your finger across the top of the nut, you shouldn't feel any little humps from the strings. Should be really smooth, and they should be perfectly even at height. Gibson, on the other hand, we already know they can't cut a nut if their life depended on it. However, Epiphone never seems to have an issue with this. Yeah, and going too light of a string too may go against your guitar as well, where you don't have the relief adjustment. And the lighter the string you go, the less tension, and the more that neck wants to drop backwards. Okay, so straighter to backward, right? So back bowing, which can cause a lot of buzz issues too, right? So it's kind of like, you got to find that sweet trade-off spot. Now, as far as brand of strings, I mean, there's a lot of brands out there, okay? What changes the tone of your guitar with strings is more the material and the gauge that they're made out of. But that's only a small amount of what changes the sound of your guitar, right? What really changes the sound of your guitar the most is your amplifier with its speaker. Okay, so the features you have on the amp, the wattage you have available to you will dictate your sound quality that can be reproduced, but the big part is definitely that speaker that's inside. I've mentioned this before that I love the sound of the speaker in my Line 6. I've thought about throwing it into my cab, though I don't have an amp for my cab anymore, so it's kind of like, well, the Line 6 can keep its speaker for now, I guess. Once I do get another amp eventually for my cab, I may just swap the speakers because I love the sound of the speaker that they put in the Line 6 Spider, what is this thing? Spider 430. You know, whereas the trainer speaker in the trainer cab used to be a Block 100 amp actually, but it's a perfect cab because it's completely sealed when you take the electronics out. So I just need to change the speaker if I want a better sounding speaker for whatever amp I hook on, because your speaker makes a huge impact on your sound, more than what your strings do. But when it comes to the strings, I like these nickel wound strings from D'Addario for my electrics, okay? Whereas for my Taylor guitar, I always buy these stock strings, which are 1253 Elixir Nano Web coated phosphorus bronze. Not the mix, but the phosphorus bronze. I don't like the mixed strings. I don't even like mixed strings, period. Even on an acoustic, I like phosphorus bronze only. They seem to last longer, they're smoother in the fingers, etc. Right? When you have a mixed string, they're cheaper strings generally too, but the mixed material, they don't last as long. They tend to be very grabby, very noisy strings. Really don't care for them myself. But you know what? To each their own, right? Pick whatever you want. I run 942s on my guitars that came with 942s. I'm not a real fan of 946, so even if a guitar came with 946, it's already been switched to 942 already because I prefer the 942 gauge on the electrics that need them. Now, as far as my SGs go, and both my Les Pauls, they use 1046 nickel wounds. And you know, I only have to change my strings maybe once a year, okay, even for the electric. And these are not coated strings either. I love the coated strings on the Taylor. This way, maybe every year, year and a half, I got to change my strings. But I also don't have a lot of acid content in my body or my skin, my fingers. You know, got the natural oil like anybody else does, but I just don't have a high acidic level, you know. So I'm not rusting out strings like every second day or after 3 hours of playing or after a couple of months. You know, my strings aren't rotting out on me and, you know, kind of flying off the guitar in pieces, right? So I can get away with not changing my strings as often as most. Therefore, I get a lot more lifespan too out of a set of strings. They stay basically newer sounding longer. Okay? And I don't even clean my strings, right? I just, you know, play my guitar, throw it back up on the wall when I'm done with it. You know, I go and I play at church, I come home, I throw it back on the wall, I'm done with it, you know, until I play it again kind of thing. I've got guitars in here that have been sitting on the wall for the last couple of months and I haven't even touched them and they're perfectly clean and fine. So that's about the string thing. You know, be careful on your gauges you choose, but also, you know, material does make a difference of what kind of sound you're going to get. But a big thing that does dictate sound is the gauge of the strings. Like even on acoustics, Martin said the same thing on acoustics, your string gauge will affect your sound, okay? Big time. It's a huge impact. It's not just about the top, you know, it's also about the strings you choose and the material you use for strings, right? So, and I mean, I've used coated Elixir strings on, I used to have a Takamine GD30 and I tried the Elixirs on it and it's like, I love them on my Taylor, but they didn't sound that great on the Takamine, right? I had the Epiphone J200, factory D'Addario strings, right? Threw on a set of Elixirs, it was like a whole ball game difference. We just threw some Elixirs actually on my wife's Mitchell guitar. Now it's not a very expensive guitar. It's about $325, $350 new. We got it for $100 off. It was on sale at the time, and we just threw Elixirs on it. So from the stock strings, whatever the heck they were kind of not bad sounding, really, you know, and quite comfortable to play. So we threw on 1253 Elixirs, and wow, even she's really happy. She's like, oh, what's a, you know, day and night difference, right? I mean, for that guitar, they sound fantastic. I have to agree with her. They sound great on that guitar, way better, right? So, you know, that's something to think about. But you can get D'Addario coated strings too if you want to try those. You know, I've never tried them yet. And I've yet to try coated strings actually on an electric, but give me time, I'll get to it. Maybe next time I change the strings on my Gibson, I'll throw on a set of Elixir Nano Webs on it, and we'll see what they sound like in comparison. We'll do a before and after test for you guys, because I think that's very important to do that. But anyways, that's what I got for you guys on strings. So, you've got a million choices out there, not necessarily any of them bad, but you are going to hear some tonal differences brand to brand, gauge to gauge, even in the same brand, or different brands too. Material types, etc. But just remember, you know, the stuff we talked about that you weren't being told about on the other videos about, you know, the nut slot has to be recut for the thicker gauge, and then when you go back thinner, you're going to have to change your nut. It's not going to be an option, otherwise things are not going to set up. Okay? Anyways, been around the fence on this one a few times. You know, I've worked on a lot of guitars too for years, not just my own, but other people's, and yeah, you do run into these things, so. But anyways, I just wanted to, you know, clarify some stuff for you guys, get my little 2 cents in on this as well. Anyways, let me know what you thought about this video, and, you know, comments go below as per usual. And as usual, thank you so much for watching, and we'll be sure to catch you on the next one. See ya!